In 1914, the Great War erupted in Europe. Men from many lands marched through the streets on their way to the battlefield, seeking only victory. Little did these brave men know, however, that the battlefield would be a far more gruesome and terrifying place than they could ever imagine. Many of the men you see now saying goodbye to their families will never return due to one of the most horrifying forms of war that the world has ever seen. We know this form today as trench warfare. The basics of trench warfare involve a series of trenches that protected both sides, and in the center was an area called no man's land, which was not safe from any artillery or machine gun fire. These numerous trenches served various purposes, but all were dug by hand by soldiers. The trenches that these men were digging would soon become their only solace in the battlefield, their only safe area. The area called no man's land between the two opposing trenches was an area covered with machine gun fire and artillery shells. The infantry's objective, as you can see in the following clips, was to go over the top of their own trench, cross no man's land, and try to take the opposing trench without losing too many men. A vast majority did not survive. The first factor that the troops had to deal with on their way across no man's land was oncoming enemy machine gun fire. The most devastating of all was the artillery fire raining down on the troops. Tanks were fairly new to the battlefield, and even though they had superior firepower, they were rendered very costly machines of war because they were constantly getting stuck and overheating. This made them unsuitable for trench warfare. Perhaps one of the most deadly factors that were involved in trench warfare was the advent of chemical warfare. It started with gases such as tear gas that were meant to immobilize the enemy and make them so they couldn't fight. Eventually, more sophisticated gases were created that were meant to kill the opponent, like mustard gas. It became almost necessary for each troop to carry their own gas mask, because if you didn't, you would become susceptible to any kind of gas that was permeating the battlefield at that time, no matter how thick or thin it may be. And now we move on to the effects of trench warfare. When soldiers would stand in cold, wet trenches all day without being able to dry off or change their socks, they would contract what was known as trench foot. This gangrenous infection affected thousands in World War I and resulted in the amputation of the affected feet. The only way to fight trench foot was to remain as dry as possible and to obtain several pairs of socks which you could change into multiple times a day. Another condition that plagued many veterans was called combat stress reaction, or otherwise commonly known as shell shock. This condition was a result of battle stress, and the most common effect was disconnection from one's surroundings, as shown in these clips. In conclusion, thousands of men died in World War I, whether as a result of immediate damage or long-standing injuries. These men made the ultimate sacrifice to keep their people safe. Even though these events happened over 100 years ago, these men were people just like all of us, but were the unfortunate victims of trench warfare and its atrocities. Never forget their sacrifices.